trustworthiness is that when a person comes back to me or when they hand me something, they can believe that the thing I did before, I'm going to do again.
Is trustworthiness, should it be in one person? Or Martha, as you're talking about, should it be in the community and the leadership of the community? And that's, I think, what we're looking at. But as long as we have a structure that puts most of the power into the hands of one or just a few people within that church, that becomes a huge challenge to say we want to have a culture of trustworthiness. Because ultimately, who's fueling that? Is it the pastor or the couple people in charge? Or do we genuinely have a culture of trustworthiness that involves people that we would assume would have a lot of power actually stepping away from it?
Thanks for joining us today for our Grace Live conversation. Today is the second part of a 6-part series on trauma-informed practices, helping us understand how we as individuals and how the faith communities, where we seek community, how our faith communities can do a better job of understanding and responding to the trauma that is around us, including when that trauma is related to abuse. Last week, we had a couple of great guests, David and Robert, who helped us understand about the first principle of trauma-informed practice, safety. After today, next month in March, we'll have David back again, along with Elizabeth Sullivan from Empower Survivors, with us to have a really informative discussion around peer support, how people can help each other who have been through sexual abuse or other forms of trauma. From there, we'll go on to talk about collaboration, empowerment, and about historical, cultural, and gender factors that enter into trauma. So we hope that you can join us for each of these conversations. We really look forward to seeing you at them. My name is Pete. I'm the Executive Director here at Grace. At Grace, our mission is to equip the faith community to better recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. We've been around since 2004 and have worked with hundreds of churches around this topic. Just in 2021, we worked with roughly 500 churches that made inquiries with us about how do they respond to abuse. And our conversations are a piece of that. Today, we are really honored as we talk about the second principle of trauma-informed practice, trustworthiness and transparency, to have two incredible guests, Martha Dixon and Boz Tchividjian. I guess I would turn it over to you guys. If you could please introduce yourselves. Let us know who you are, a little bit of your background, and then we can get into the conversation.
Martha?
Okay, my name is Martha Kearse, and I'm a pastor here in Lynchburg. I was high school English teacher first, and then I've been in ministry for about 20 years. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here and honored to be part of the conversation.
Awesome. My name is Boz Tchividjian. I'm the founder of Grace, a former executive director, and I am currently a practicing attorney who really focuses almost exclusively on representing abuse survivors around the country in court cases, mostly litigation cases against organizations and individuals that either failed to protect them or failed to respond appropriately. And so I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here with Martha. I was friends with Martha when we lived up in the frigid cold of Lynchburg, Virginia. We're now in Florida. And yeah, what a joy to get to know her and to be able to hang out with you, Martha, this afternoon is great. Awesome.
Yeah, for me too.
The frigid cold of Lynchburg. What? I'm in Minnesota here. We're getting a
I'm sorry
snowstorm today.
Yeah, I think it's like 73 degrees out right now. It's nice.
Oh my goodness.
We're winter light in Virginia.
Okay, that's not too bad. I can handle that.
I think we'll be below zero tonight. So
okay, well that's Victor used to keep telling me to move to Winona. And I said, Victor, why would I move there? I said, people get sentenced to places like that. Why would you go there voluntarily? So I'm sorry, Pete, but you're always welcome down here in the crazy state of Florida.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And as we got started, as I was talking with Zane, preparing for the second part of our conversation on trauma-informed practice, preparing for a conversation about trustworthiness, one of the first things that Zane said to me was, we need to have my pastor on because she is trustworthy. Mm. And one of the things that Zane and I agreed is we need to have Boz on because for years he has been trustworthy to survivors, to students, to the church at large. And so we could not think of two better people to be on board. So thank you both for being here today and also for being people that I consider to be trustworthy.
Thank you.
And that brings up a question, though. I consider you to be trustworthy. What even is that? I mean, what is trustworthiness and transparency? So we say that that's important. What is it?
Mm.
Well, I mean, those are interesting. When we start talking about this conversation, it really forced me to really think about these words because we throw around the word trust, trustworthy. I probably hear the word trust more than trustworthy a lot. And I hear that a lot in churches. I hear that a lot. I think a lot of listeners would probably say they've heard that a lot from their church leaders. And then to think through, okay, but what does that mean? And is there a difference between the term trust and trustworthy? And as I thought about it, in its simplest way I could describe it, for me, trust tends to be focused on me. Trustworthy is focused on you. So trust, when I say trust me, okay, that in some sense is a fairly self-interested comment, trust me. Where trustworthy empowers the other person to determine whether or not they want to trust versus me saying to trust. And to me, that's a huge difference because oftentimes when I hear somebody or an organization say, trust us, that's a red flag. Mm-hmm. But it sounds good. And it sounds, when church leaders talk about, you need to trust us. We're church leaders. God has placed us in this position. So trust us. Anytime you're having to tell other people to trust you, it's like somebody telling other people that they're humble. It's very self-focused, where trustworthy is saying, you know what? That's ultimately that's not my call. It's the other person's decision. Now, do I have a role in that? Yeah, because I think what words and actions over a long period of time can hopefully engender a degree of trustworthiness. But even that's still not my call. That's not my decision. That is the decision of others. And so I think, I think it really, and so when you hear I deal with this a lot with organizations, when they are saying trust us, even if they mean well, what I think they don't realize is, do you realize what you're doing? You're actually still holding on to the power, and you're still saying you need to trust us. And instead of letting go of power and saying, no, you determine whether you trust us, whether we are trustworthy, and then focus on doing that. Focus on being trustworthy in your words and your actions, but ultimately knowing that that's not going to be your call and your decision. It's going to be the decisions of others. And I think that if we can get to that type of understanding, I think it goes to, like I said a minute ago, to the very heart of a lot of the issues I deal with in the church, and that is power. This differential of power. So even when we're trying to do it right in the church, we're telling people to trust us, we still don't even, sometimes we don't even realize we're fueling the same toxicity that has oftentimes been the cause of so much of the harm in the church. Instead of saying, and that's power, rather than releasing power and saying, we're not going to determine whether you trust us. That's your determination, not ours. But people giving up power and influence is quite a challenge, inside and outside of the church.
Yeah. And if the focus is trust me and then you don't, that's your failing because you're not
Correct.
A trusting person.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
I think it's interesting that you've paired trustworthiness and transparency. I've been thinking about the relationship between those two things, because it is transparency that reveals your trustworthiness, right? So the degree to which you're willing to be transparent, that's one part of your trustworthiness. But also, I know when you're doing a program, you gotta keep it pithy. But I think of several other words. The main one that I come to is reliable. Like, trustworthiness is that when a person comes back to me or when they hand me something, they can believe that the thing I did before, I'm going to do again. What's interesting too is to think so trustworthiness is neutral, right? Trustworthiness is like, I can trust you to do what you did before, whether that was good or bad. Letting go, the positive thing of trust, like when I let go and I lean on you, and you can either catch me or I fall, right? That only comes with a consistent reliability. I don't know if you want to hold off on this, but I would love to talk about the idea of children and where I get my kind of vision. Is this a good time to go into that?
Yeah, I think now is a great time. That was an incredible story that you shared yesterday. Yeah.
Well, I just think I was a teacher in high school and then a children's minister. And the thing about children, and this is true of adults as well, but it's just so visible in children, is if you're paying attention, children will tell you at what level they trust you. So there's children who, like, when they meet you, they leap forward and you're best friends. And, and there's children who can be won over for a vanilla wafer, and they're pretty easy. And then there's always and this is at every age. This is with babies. This is with young children. This is with teenagers. There is the child in the back of the room who is looking at you skeptically and who's like, you just stay right over there. And my experience, I've watched a lot of church people, and, the church person who comes forward into the space of that child and touches them or pats them or hands them things or asks them questions, that child just shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. But if you're patient and you do just what Boz was talking about, if you're conscious of, I need to be reliable, I need to be consistent, and I need to wait until that child gives me permission to enter their lives. Then you can earn the right to that child, and they'll tell you when they're ready for you to come in. But if you insist, if you want to be the adult who says, trust me, then you never get that child's trust. But if you're able to cede that power and give the agency to the child and say, whatever day you're willing to let me in, I'm here. but you set that time. My experience is they will eventually come and let you in. As long as what they consistently see is you're never going to cross that line. And that's been a really important lesson for me that applies across the board in my dealings with people. There's 80-year-olds who are just like, you just stay right over there. And you just give them a minute, and it's their time. It's their job to say when you get to come in.
Yeah. And that's part of the distinction, right? Between being trustworthy, worthy of trust, rather than insisting that somebody trust you.
Yes.
You recognize it's your job to be worthy.
I think we also have to help equip others to know what trustworthiness looks like. Because I deal a number of my cases, more than I would have ever imagined, are the privilege of representing victims of adult clergy abuse. That's where adult clergy have spent time grooming and creating a trustworthiness of a victim, where then they, and that victim ends up trusting them, not because oftentimes, this is the deceitful part of it, not because they're insisting on being trusted, that the real predators will be very patient in developing that trust. And so and it's even more effective for them if they are empowering their target to trust them. So like, not me insisting it, but I'm going to do things and say things and be reliable and be consistent for a long period of time, where that person begins to then truly, genuinely trust me. And that's when I then begin to violate so many boundaries. And that's a tough one, because we want people to determine, I want others through, like Martha said, it has to be earned and it can't be demanded. And ultimately the other person makes that decision. But some of these, especially some of these clergy offenders, they get that.
Yeah.
And they are most effective in their grooming and their abuse by being patient, sometimes months, because they know that the trust is that much stronger if that target victim is the one that came to the conclusion of trusting them, rather than me insisting on that they trust them. And there's no easy answer to that. I wish I could say, well, this is what you do, A, B, and C. But I do think it's worth talking about and helping equip others especially within faith communities, to understand that dynamic, that trustworthiness alone is not enough. You have to understand what trustworthiness looks like and still have those antennas up for those who are really apt at even exploiting something like this in order to abuse.
So this is where I think it's so important that the narrative of the church be truly transparent, right? Mm-hmm. So the church that I came from, it doesn't, the one where I worked as a children's minister and then associate pastor, it doesn't have stories of a clergy member sexually abusing children, but it has stories, and they involve adultery on the staff. They involve child abuse from church members who were then allowed to return. And the thing about church histories is, that's not listed in the official church history that's on the church website. Nope. And not necessarily advocating for that on the church website, but the narrative of church that does not include our worst moments sets us up for having those moments again. So transparency, to me, covers a lot of ground. It covers me being transparent so that somebody asks me, I mean, a perfect example is if I am doing something with young people, then I'm going to say, this is how I'm keeping your children safe. And you should know this. You should know who's going to be driving your child. So that kind of transparency, that's one level. But then there's the systemic transparency of us being willing to tell our story and being willing to put on the table, yes, it absolutely can happen here, right here in this particular church, this particular faith organization. We are 100% vulnerable. And that kind of transparency sets us up. I won't say that I think you can prevent it, absolutely. I will say that I think that teaching people to watch, teaching people that this is not, we're not accusing anybody of anything in specific, but we are watching, and we have policies then in place. We know what happens. For example, a 2-adult rule. Those 2 adults know why they're both there. They understand. If I have to leave, these are the reasons I would leave, and this is how quickly I come back, and this is why. And that kind of transparency sets us up for, I guess, a better chance of success.
Yeah,
it's essential.
To tag along with the transparent, I think that's so true. I've always said transparency means credibility, and I'm often maybe thinking transparency, genuine transparency is maybe trustworthiness or a major element of that. Because when I think of transparency, Martha, you said it a second ago, in an institutional context, when an institution is transparent, it means that they're vulnerable. Mm. And when they're vulnerable, what they do is they shift, again, going back to that power, they shift the power away from themselves, because when they're not transparent, they control the narrative. They unilaterally control the narrative, whether it's the narrative of the church's reputation, their church history, whatever it is, they control that narrative. We're saying, okay, we're going to be transparent. We're taking our hands off of that. We're being vulnerable, and we're going to let you as a person, we're going to, again, empower you to see and know who we are, good, bad, and ugly, and to determine for yourselves whether we are a trustworthy community. Yeah. But again, it's holding on to that power of who wants to do that. If you're a church leader who's wanting to be transparent in that way. Now, they may talk about transparency because transparency has generally a positive connotation. So we like transparency, but are they actually transparent? And I think one way we can help determine that is, have they taken their hands off the control of defining who they are and allowing others to make that determination based on all of the stuff. And and that's a challenge, because controlling the narrative, even if you're not consciously thinking of it, controlling the narrative is so important for so many organizational leaders. And sometimes it's done even piously, like we have to control this because it's for the glory of God. If we are that vulnerable and show some of the things you're talking about, that could be a poor witness of Christ in our community, which is just junk. But you still have to deal with that, because that's what people oftentimes have grown up understanding and realizing, and oftentimes has been taught to them by leaders in their faith community.
Well, when I was in teaching, they started doing evaluations. And the principal came in when we were doing the evaluations, which he was not supposed to do. And he said to all of us teachers, he said, you wouldn't want to work at a school that was less than A+. And I think that church people kind of have that kind of white knuckling on their reputation. You ask any church member and, is your church friendly? And they're going to be like, oh, everybody knows we're the friendliest church. And I mean, no, probably not. Probably haven't done the welcoming. I one of the first things I did when I came here was the sign at the street, and hand to God, I would have done this at any church. So not particular here, but the sign at the church says all are welcome. First thing I did, that's gone, because no, probably not. That to say those words, to say to the world, any single one of you that shows up at our door, we're ready for, and we're safe for you, and you're welcome here. That is an incredible amount of work. And very few churches, I think, are able to do the work of releasing that white knuckle hold on their story and trusting the world with it, and understanding that actually our faults are a relief to most people. Like, I'm not perfect, so, you know, how am I going to find a place for myself if you're telling me your church never did anything wrong? Yeah. I think that one of the things that we're dealing with right now in the church is this hold. And Boz, I mean, you keep using that word power. I think that is incredibly important for everybody to understand, that churches are about power. And if you don't understand the power structure in churches, it will eat you, and it will allow your predators in, because they understand power very well.
It is heartbreaking to say that about a church. And it is heartbreaking that it's true. And
well, I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I
was just going to say, the thing about church people is, like, that doesn't make them bad people. People who are self-selecting for a faith organization in 2022 are doing something. They're choosing something for self-improvement, even if they don't achieve it. It's their goal is self-improvement. They're trying to do what they think they ought to do. The problem is there's so much fear, and they've been given and spoon-fed so much fear and theologies of fear that they struggle to differentiate, you know, there's been a mistake from identity, and peeling that apart so that people can keep a solid identity, child of God, but you made a mistake. I don't know when we're going to break that.
Yeah. And the more fear, the more you have to control to hold off the fear. And fear breeds this desire to control, and it creates this cycle.
Well, I mean, two things quickly come to mind that I just in this topic that I've experienced in the last few years. One is, let's go back to kids. I remember doing a lot of work with our investigation with missionary organizations, and how many, maybe some of the viewers would resonate with this, how many missionary kids would go on the mission field, would land, would enter into this mission compound, didn't know anybody except mom or dad and their siblings, and immediately are instructed to refer to everybody in the mission compound as either uncle or aunt such and such.
Wow.
And I had survivors say, that was done because what that was telling us is these are trustworthy people, trust them. But they had their parents and leaders saying trustworthy, and just by the label that they used. And it was that same false sense of trust that allowed the predators within that compound, who the child would call uncles such and such or aunt such and such, who then would access and abuse that child because they were pushed, did exactly the opposite of what you were just saying, Martha, earlier, about letting that child determine if and when they want to trust that person. And it was done, I think it wasn't done in an evil way. I think they're like, they're in a strange world and it'd just be good to know everybody. But what they didn't realize, at least most, didn't realize the immense damage and vulnerability it was creating amongst the children, and ultimately the harm that was created. And then the other thing real quick is, on the other end of the spectrum, going back to adult clergy abusers, one of the things that I have found over and over again is, and people probably might resonate with this too, and it's not just clergy abusers, but where the way the predator gains trust is, like I said earlier, not so often saying, trust me, but where they cross the line where I see that they've been most effective in gaining the trust of their target victim has been when they begin to demonstrate this false sense of vulnerability to the victim, where they begin to open up, the pastor or the associate pastor begins to open up to this particular person about their own failings, about their own struggles. And oh my goodness, like if your faith leader begins to open up to you about their own struggles, right, so often, you see yourself as in this very unique, almost enviable position. And second, I've seen the walls, any walls you had up, just crumble down, because it's like, wow, they trust me enough. They're trusting me enough to share vulnerable information. And therefore, oh my goodness, of course I trust them. And man, that has been, I could spend the rest of our time together rattling off case after case after case. That's why I still go back to, maybe that'd be a good topic for another day, is what can we do to help equip people, individuals? And we're still learning, but how to be able to discern these types of things, because even though they may say the right things and they may be demonstrating the value of trustworthiness, it may be far more deceptive and far darker than we think of what they're doing, and how to be able to see some of those signs. I think could be, I know I have a lot of clients that would have really appreciated that information prior to being abused.
Yeah.
Now, I think systemically, one of the things we could do is to train churches about how to tell when someone is vulnerable. What does that look like? So being able to look at a group of people and say, okay, now, who are the most vulnerable people that we have, right? So one of the first things I noticed here was that the carpet had tears in the seams. It was not put in well, and it had all these tripping hazards in a congregation for people, a third of whom are over 80. And it's a very simple thing. And also the two layers where people come up to read from, it's slate. So it's slippery and there's no handholds. So that's a very simple thing to look at, to say, all right, so kids, fine. They're not, if they fall, they're fine. Put a Band-Aid on it. Younger adults, fine. 80-year-olds, not fine with tripping hazards. Can we fix that? And I think that's been the thing, is kind of sussing out who is vulnerable in what situation. So bathrooms, most people fine and safe, especially if you've got handicap bars. Trans person, are they safe in your bathrooms? At that point, they become the vulnerable person. Their vulnerability rises to the level of priority. I think we could teach people that, and that language, that idea of transparency. This is real. These can happen. Safety is important. It's a value. It is a central tenet of our faith, that the space we have, that we bring people into, is safe. That is hospitality. That is the basic rule of our faith, that when someone is in your space, you will literally let yourself be killed before you'll let them be harmed. And rising
love.
Yes. And raising that hospitality as a value, and then starting to talk about, so who is receiving poor hospitality from us? I find that resonates. Southern people in general, they think of themselves as hospitable. And if you tell them, no, you're not being hospitable, you're not safe, that tends to resonate. And it's not some of the language that comes out, that especially older people hear, they resist it. They're like, no, I'm a good person. So anyway, I think that's kind of the job of the church going forward, is we can't pretend anymore that we're okay. And we need to stop allowing churches to continue without good policies, without addressing their safety, without understanding vulnerability. That's a permission that we can just remove.
Yeah. Wow, some very powerful points. I think some of the key takeaways that I've heard from the comments you guys have made are the connection between trust and power, how those things are just inseparable, how trustworthiness is so important, but can also be manipulated. It can also be used as a weapon. And in your description of things, including grooming, how you've highlighted that it's not just that a person is grooming an individual, but that person is grooming an entire community. That person is trying to get the community to trust them. And when you were talking about a missionary child being told, you can trust, and all I could think of is, and then they're abused. And what does that person say? No one will believe you because they trust me.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's already been proven. Yeah. So I think very powerful points that you both have had throughout our conversation. We've also had a few questions get sent in, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to get to some of these questions. The first one, as a leader in the church, what are some steps we can take to develop trustworthiness, especially for people who have been hurt or burned or traumatized by the church? As you think about answering that question, if I could ask you to please try and bring in, just in general, but also, how do you bring trustworthiness into prevention? How do you bring trustworthiness into your response to an allegation? And how do you bring trustworthiness into it if you find out that 20 years ago, somebody in your congregation was abused? So before, during, and after, how do we bring that in?
Yeah, those are really, really critically important questions, and they're complex and they're not easily answered. But I think we're still in the process of trying to figure, like, okay, how does this integrate with all of these areas that you've talked about? And part of it, this is just my own opinion. I was talking to somebody the other day. I said, part of it makes it a greater challenge for us in the Western Christian church, because I'm convinced that the overall structure of church, and hopefully Martha will still talk to me after this, but the overall structure of our churches is, there's something amiss about it. I was with a friend of mine last weekend in New York, and he said, do you want to come to my Greek Orthodox service? I said, sure. So we went to his little church, walked down the street, and came to his church, and there might have been 20 people in there, and most of it was in Greek, so I really didn't understand a lot of it. But the priest ultimately, after a long time, gets up and gives a homily. It was like a 10-minute sermon, but it was a homily. And I just remember leaving that service, and it was helpful, but I just remember leaving that service going, man, like, this service, and I've seen this in some other traditions, the apex of the service is the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. It's Jesus. And how my entire life, the apex of the services that I went to was what? The sermon. We went to the church to determine, based on the pastor. In fact, it came home to me that night because I was looking on Facebook, and somebody said, Pastor such and such is preaching in our church this week. I can't wait to go, which is all an innocent, sweet comment. But I compared that with my experience that morning, and I said, wow, like, something's amiss, because we've created this power, usually in one person, usually in one man, yes, who gets up week after week, and the culmination of this service is his presentation from the pulpit, and nobody's going to interrupt him, and right, he's got 30 minutes if you're lucky, elevated, 45 if you're not so lucky, of uninterrupted conversation, and not just conversation, it's uninterrupted telling us what the Bible is all about and what's right belief. And I guess I say all of this to say that becomes part of the issue, is the very nature and structure of our churches today makes all of this a really significant challenge. Somebody asked earlier, what happens if our church is not doing this? I'd say give it some work. Otherwise, get out. Remember, church is not a prison. You can leave. And
there's
and
another
I know
one in town.
Yeah, there's many in town, and you might have to leave a bunch of them before you find one. But so trustworthiness is ultimately, when you talk about what does that look like in a church, I mean, again, giving up the power. I would love to be in a church where the pastor says, listen, we had a church in Lynchburg. I remember I went a couple of times, but they had co-pastors. And there's a part of me that's sort of like that. There's kept it from one getting too big. But, the pastor saying, I'm going to step away from easily attained power. How about take that back? Maybe what we could do is create let's talk about the structure within our very own church where I'm not the sum leader of, even though we have elders and all that, we know that the pastor's still running the show, because ultimately what you're saying, Pete, is trustworthiness. Should it be in one person? Or Martha, as you're talking about, should it be in the community and the leadership of the community? And that's, I think, what we're looking at. But as long as we have a structure that puts most of the power into the hands of one or just a few people within that church, that becomes a huge challenge to say we want to have a culture of trustworthiness. Because ultimately, who's fueling that? Is it the pastor or the couple people in charge? Or do we genuinely have a culture of trustworthiness that involves people that we would assume would have a lot of power actually stepping away from that, or aspects of it? And I don't have any answers. It's easier to complain than have the answers. But
I'll share a happy story.
Thank you.
When my wife and I were looking for a new church a little over a year ago, we ended up checking out a church online, and the pastor was giving a sermon on humility. And the entire focus of the sermon was, your leaders need to be humble. Our church can expect leaders who are humble. And if our leaders aren't humble, everyone in this church needs to know you can call us out, because humility starts with your leaders. And that humility, I'm not going to demand that you give me respect. In fact, I'm going to be humble. And I want you to know that you can demand my humility. You can expect my humility as your leader or as your pastor. That is a heart and a message that then goes and lays the groundwork for trust, because now that person knows nobody owes them trust. Nobody owes them respect. So to me, that was powerful and incredibly encouraging for me as I was going through a search trying to find a new church not that long ago. Yeah. And it resonates with what you guys are saying, the humility to not demand trust, and to not have it be centered around one person.
I think that, to your original comment there, Boz, there's a lot of stuff in the church that needs to die. And if we're ever going to have an Easter resurrection of the church, quite a few Good Fridays need to happen. And one of them is this idea of the pastor as somehow separate. I wear a robe when I lead worship, and the reason I do is because then I don't have to worry about what I'm wearing. But I really actually think that is just a silliness, because if we're going to be people who say the priesthood of all believers, then it's great to have a person who I think there is a place for a person who has set aside through education and willingness to spend time. I think I had a friend who used to say that we're working ourselves out of a job, and I don't agree. I think there is a role for the pastor, but I think it's only the one role in a church. And if we could get to a place where, like, okay, so the pastor has this role, and then here's this role, and here's this role. And when church community is working well, you can find that here's the finance person who's brilliant and who also has a heart, and they bring that. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say, I think that humility thing is a little different for women. Just in that we're already there. And I don't like to play the card of, oh, poor women in ministry. But I will say that I think women in the 21st century who are stepping into that role, most of the ones I know already come with that humility. They've had to fight to get there. And so when I come, I already have some humility. I'm very grateful for the one church that would hire me, that they actually did hire me. But I think there's also this pointedness that, and it's hard for men and women in ministry to have, which is being willing to call out when something is wrong in the system, being willing to push back against leaders who fail in their humility, being able to find the bully system wherever it is, because 100% of faith organizations have bully systems in them. And so looking for that, where is the power being abused? And being able to teach people how you push back, giving them tools so that, because again, one of the things is they don't genuinely believe that it could happen here. So creating a language around, well, no, it's happening right now. So there it is. And here's, let's stop it. Let's not throw people under the bus. We don't have to have martyrs in order to say this behavior is not appropriate and we're not going to have it here. I call it the Barbara Dixon rule. This is my mother's rule, is you just say how things are and pretend like everybody agrees with you. So I started early on here saying things like, from the pulpit, things like, we don't talk about each other. We talk to each other. We don't gossip about each other, which is not true. Totally happens. Every church has gossip. But you start to change that zeitgeist and you remove permissions. You don't have permission to talk about me to someone else. I do not give permission for that. You don't have permission to talk to me about someone else. I don't give permission for that. And I think you can start to create a culture where it's possible to say, well, now, okay, this happened and it didn't feel right. What could we do about it? And that starts to loosen that fear. I think you can consciously work towards loosening that fear so that people deal with small things and are more ready for the big ones, ready to talk about how you prevent the big ones.
Yeah, that's great. We've got time for one final question. And we've had a few questions, so I'm sorry for those questions that we're not going to get to. But this is a question: how do survivors navigate this relational minefield? It's terrifying that trust and trustworthiness can be manipulated. How do we navigate it? How do we avoid perpetual paranoia? Thoughts for survivors who are out there. Can I trust anyone? Can I trust these faith leaders? And if they're just going to weaponize that trust, what do I do?
I mean, another tough question. I mean, survivors more than any other group of people have reasons not to trust. And which means that trustworthiness is huge, and developing the trust in those around them oftentimes takes longer than perhaps other people. And for people in churches and faith communities to know that and understand that and to recognize that, and to embrace that and say, yeah, I don't want this person to just automatically trust. We have to work even harder. Might have to work twice as hard ultimately to earn trust, relational trust. And it's okay. And to let survivors know that's okay. You have instincts oftentimes as a result of the trauma that was perpetrated upon you, that are instincts that are self-protective instincts. And you shouldn't ignore those. Now, you shouldn't oftentimes, like you said, the other end of the spectrum is, almost a constant paranoia of everybody is untrustworthy. But the reality is maybe you start with that. You start with everybody is untrustworthy. And those in your small group of people that you begin to connect with, over time, you develop a trustworthiness. And that's just going to take longer. And I think the other thing to do is for survivors, keep your eyes and antennas open, antennas out there to see how are church leaders responding to others? How are church leaders? Because we tell churches all the time that anytime you were dealing or responding to an abuse allegation, there's a lot of people watching you. And probably the most important grouping of people that are watching you, other than the reported victim, are other survivors in the church. And most of them you probably don't even know are survivors. And they're watching how you respond, and they're determining for themselves, which is good, are you as an institution and as a leader trustworthy? And how you respond to others in other times of need. And it doesn't always have to be sexual abuse allegations. It could be many other things. Speak volumes to people about trustworthiness. And so if you're in a church where you're watching some of that, and you watch somebody who's expressed concern to one of the church leaders, and they got shut out immediately or shut down immediately, that's not safe. Mm-hmm. And the leader needs to understand, if they even care to understand and are teachable, to go, what I just did shuts out any genuine opportunity at becoming trustworthy, especially with people who've been hurt so badly. How do I change that? The sad thing that I have found is a lot of church leaders don't really care. And that's the time where you have to probably exit. But anyway, Martha, might address that better than I, but those are just some of the initial thoughts.
No, those are good. And I have two things. One is policies. I would say it is the job of pastors and church leaders to create good policies that protect people to the best of their ability. If someone is a survivor, and I want to be careful here because I don't like to tell people what to do when that's not my personal experience. Asking what the policies are. I think that is base level. I think any organization that welcomes people through their doors ought to have policies about their safety. Particularly organizations that invite children and elderly people and disabled people and people on the LGBTQIA spectrum. And I mean, people. You should have policies that protect them. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I think I would go back to the idea of the narrative. So the people I get most often are people who are hurt by church theology. I have not had many people present to me at my church, I've been sexually abused in the church, but I have a bunch of people who land on my doorstep who have been abused by their church system, by a painful and cruel theology. And so one of the things that I try to offer is a narrative that says, so I'm not worried about you. I'm here and I've got stuff I can do for you if you need me, but I'm not coming after you. I'm just here. And so, and in the meantime, I'm not worried that you're going to hell, and I'm not, praying for you. I can pray for you if you want me to, but I don't have this thing where it's like, you're not right and I'm going to go fix you. And I think having a narrative in your church that allows for space, people can come and they can leave, and they can come one Sunday and they cannot come for 6 months, and they're still fine. And it's their job to say, this is what I need. One of the things that I think is really important that I share as my policy is I'm going to take you at your word. So if you tell me you want me to visit you, I'm going to come visit you. If you don't tell me you want me to visit you, I'm not coming. And if you say to me, I'm fine, I'm going to say, okay, you said you're fine. I'm going to take you at your word. If you say to me you're suicidal, I'm going to take you at your word. I'm gonna go then and treat you like you need very significant help. So I found that to be a very effective narrative in allowing people the space. You tell me what it is you want from me. I'm gonna follow your lead. I'm gonna actually do what it is you told me you wanted, and that reliability, that consistency, that's the best I can do. And I think it's what I think churches are capable of it.
Yeah. We need to wrap up. This has been a great conversation. I want to just throw out one point of clarification. Martha, you talked about kind of setting expectations around behavior. And one of the examples that you gave was limiting gossip and not having people spreading rumors and things like that. Do you feel comfortable just commenting real quickly, bearing in mind that we're short on time, your thoughts on how that applies to disclosing abuse? Is disclosing abuse gossip?
That is such a great distinction. And this is why I think it's so important to have policies that give here's the pathway. Here's who you talk to. And if someone comes to you and they say, someone came to me and they told me they'd been abused, that person knows, okay, this is what happens next. So you train your people to be ready to hear that. That's not gossip. That's not incidental. I would equate that more with what I was just saying. I'm going to take you at your word. If you tell me that this has happened to you, that's where we're going. I am going to believe you. And so that's, it's so great that you drew that distinction, because to me, gossip, talking about somebody, has an intent for power, for yourself. Disclosure is about listening and believing. Those are so hard to distinguish, but really important to understand the difference. I'm glad you brought that up.
Great. Thank you very much. I like that distinction. So yes. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, very much for joining us today. We hope that we see you next week when we talk about peer support, or next month, rather, not next week. Next month when we talk about peer support. And we have David Pittman from Together We Heal and Elizabeth Sullivan from Empower Survivors. I want to also make you aware that we've got a conference coming up called Keeping Faith, which is a 2-day virtual conference on April 26th and 27th. It would be wonderful if you could join us. You can register at www.zeroabuseproject.org, and we'd love to see you there. It's a 2-day conference on the intersection of child abuse and faith, and it will provide essential information on policies, responding to known sex offenders, how do we keep our kids safe, how do we collaborate between the faith community and mental health providers, how do we understand what is going on in the life of a person who may have experienced abuse. So please come and join us. We would love to see you there, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.